Hey everybody, this is Dr. Wolf, and we're going to get started with the mood disorders PowerPoint. The first thing that I want y'all to pay attention to is this language between what we call clinical levels, or something that is diagnosable, and something that is subclinical. Clinical or diagnosable, as you can tell, means that you meet the required number of symptoms, and thus because you have the required number of symptoms, you meet the threshold to be diagnosed with whatever the topic is. After that, we might use specifiers to say your case is mild or moderate or severe, and each of these tell me how many more symptoms they have beyond the threshold. Subclinical, however, which is also sometimes called subthreshold or even minor or subsyndromal, these are someone who does not have enough symptoms to be diagnosed, all right? But at the time they see someone, they still have their functioning impacted in some kind of way, and or they could benefit from some kind of services. So many people might talk about having depression or being depressed. But in fact, what they have is a subclinical level. It's enough where they could use some services, but not enough to actually meet the criteria for a clinical level. Now, occasionally, we refer to this group of subclinical as the worried well. This is primarily what counselors see is the worried well, because they are able to function most days, but not every day, and thus, of course, could benefit from services. So if we look at kind of the spectrum down here, we go from subclinical to mild, all right, to dysthymia, which we'll talk about in a moment, to moderate or severe depression, okay? So this unit is on mood disorders, and if we look at the mood disorder tree I've built you here, you can see that it can be divided into two groups: depressive disorders and bipolar disorders. Depressive disorders only have one pole. That pole is depression, whereas bipolar disorders have two poles: depression and mania. So we have our depressive disorders, of which there are two: major depression and dysthymia, which is also sometimes referred to as persistent depressive disorder. And in our bipolar disorders, we have bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia. So let's start with depression. What is major depression? Well, the things to pay attention to here is that you have to have at least 5 of these symptoms to be clinical. Now, if you have 4 or 3 or 2, well, then that might mean that you are subclinical. You also have to have all 5 of them during the same 2-week period, all right? So if you think about a major depressive episode or major depression, it's usually brief, all right? It might cycle, it might return routinely, but it's brief, as opposed to dysthymia, which we'll see in a minute, is not brief. So what are our symptoms? Well, our symptoms are things like depressed mood, which I think all of us in, this class could have guessed that one of the symptoms should be depressed mood, right? But we also have diminished interest or pleasure. This is also referred to as anhedonia, all right? And that's going to be a really important word, because anhedonia means a lack of pleasure in things that used to be pleasurable. It's kind of a key feature of depression. Number C is significant weight loss or weight gain, just as D is insomnia or hypersomnia, right? That's important to pay attention to, that sometimes we only think of depression as the, lay in bed, sleep all day, don't eat, or we think of it as the lay in bed, sleep all day, eat a lot, right? Eat a lot of comfort foods. But it can go either way. You can gain or lose weight, and you can sleep or not sleep. Now, when we think about this weight loss or weight gain, pay attention that it's not because they are dieting, okay? See how when you are not dieting is in my blurb over here? And it's not actually a loss of appetite necessarily. It's more of a symptom, right, that comes from the depression itself, right? So it's not that the person is intending to lose or gain weight. Moving down to E, psychomotor agitation or retardation. This can mean psychomotor agitation is actually fidgetedness. And psychomotor retardation is when everything is slower, right? Like it takes a lot of effort to move, all right? Again, we tend to think more of the retardation than the agitation, but both are possible. F is fatigue or loss of energy. This is the one that I find that clients struggle the most with because that loss of energy is what keeps them from being able to function in the roles of their life. Um, G is feelings of worthlessness, and that's the one that probably scares me the most. That and hopelessness are major predictors of suicidality. We will have a whole unit, by the way, on suicidality later on. H, diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness. As students, I really hope that y'all pay attention to this one, right? That your depression actually takes up cognitive resources. And because it takes up cognitive resources, it means that you have a harder time actually thinking or concentrating or performing on your schoolwork. And the last one is recurrent thoughts of death or suicide ideation. Again, we'll have a whole module on suicidality and self-injury. I think it's really important for us as a society to realize, though, that depression is not the only mental illness or diagnosis that is associated with suicide. It is one of the only ones that's actually one of the criteria, but suicide does not guarantee that someone had depression. Suicidal thoughts does not guarantee someone has depression. In fact, the two biggest ones that people point to are depression and schizophrenia, actually. Lots of people ignore the suicide risk that's with schizophrenia. The interesting thing, though, is if you actually look at it, the disorder that actually has the highest suicide risk is in our eating disorder chapter that we'll get to later. So really important that you not assume that just because someone's depressed, they're suicidal, or just because someone is suicidal, they have major depression. Okay. Now, if we skip down to C, right, you see this cause clinically significant distress or impairment of functioning. Again, because a lot of what we focus on in psychology is about your ability to function. Going back to that information from the first couple of modules where we talked about, what is it that we look for? We're not just labeling things that are abnormal or different. We're labeling things that represent stagnation, a lack of functioning, that sort of stuff. Also, we want to make sure that this is not due to a medical condition, right? Or because you are on some kind of substance like a downer, and that it's not just because you are bereaved, all right? And again, bereaved meaning that you've experienced a great loss. So then we move to persistent depressive disorder, which is also called dysthymia. And this is a chronic low-grade depression. So your symptoms are not as severe, but it's chronic. And what do I mean by chronic? Well, you have to have it for 2 years, unless you're a child, and then it's just 1 year because they have shorter little lives, right? So again, depression, 2 weeks, dysthymia, 2 years. So chronic low grade. Anytime you see the phrase chronic low grade, it's either going to be dysthymia or cyclothymia. That thymia root is how you know it's chronic low grade. All right. So this is kind of visual representation of mood. All right. What I would pay attention to is this line here, right? This kind of like icy blue line, right? This is your normal mood. Notice how it fluctuates, right? But it never gets into mania or all the way down into depression. Okay. This is what we would call euthymic, all right, or normal mood. Then if we look at this kind of dark blue line, that's major depression. See, I'm in the euthymic area and then boom, crash way down. I'm down here kind of a brief period though, and then back up, right? And then down again, okay? And then back up and down, all right? But then I'm crossing this line, okay? And then this more gray line, that's dysthymia. Notice how it's always down here in depression. It doesn't get down as low as the dark blue line for major depression, but it never actually crosses over into euthymia, right? So chronic low grade, you can clearly see there, all right? Now, when we talk about depression, one of the things that's really important to talk about that I'm always surprised that your book doesn't really highlight is Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy. If you've heard of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, the C in CBT is cognitive theory. And cognitive comes most substantially from Aaron Beck, okay? And most of his cognitive theory is actually based on depression. He studied people who were depressed, and what he found is that they had three types of negative cognitions or negative thoughts. They had negative thoughts about the self, they had negative thoughts about the world, and they had negative thoughts about the future. So I am worthless, the world is unfair, the future is hopeless, all right? But that these also worked in a cycle to feed into each other, okay? So if we start down here with the negative views about oneself, I am worthless. Then we move up, negative views about the world. Everyone hates me because I'm worthless, and I'll never be good at anything because everyone hates me. And then this just cycles around, all right? These are really toxic thoughts, right? And what I tell my clients often is that the thing about your thoughts is that you are trapped with your thoughts 24 hours a day, right? And that means that your thoughts become very impactful. What other people say are just moments, just drops in the bucket. But what you say to yourself really adds up because you have more time to say it to yourself. And that's why it's so important that we work on making sure that our thoughts are not these negative, self-fulfilling, self-defeating, problematic thoughts. Now, Beck also talked about how beliefs would turn into assumptions, right? So, if I am not loved, then life is not worth living. Okay. And again, this maintains depression, right? So we have some kind of life event comes in. This makes me sad emotionally. Then physically, I have symptoms like I'm tired or apathetic. I have cognitive symptoms such as poor concentration. Then I have behavioral symptoms such as I start to avoid people, I stay in bed, I don't do the things that used to be fun. And then finally, these negative beliefs and assumptions. I'll never do anything right. I'm useless. And then that just becomes, again, this maintenance cycle. All right. Okay, so let's talk briefly about some of the major constructs or concepts that are related to depression. Basically, depression, subclinical and clinical, have both been linked to some major other negative constructs or negative outcomes. It's not a good thing, right? One of the biggest ones that I want people to pay attention to is loneliness. When we think about the things that our society associates with depression, I think a lot of us maybe understood that weight gain or weight loss piece, or that impacts to your ability to function or staying in bed, that sort of thing. But what we find is that it's actually also linked to loneliness. At the same time, loneliness itself has been linked to impaired sleep, suicide ideation. I mean, basically a whole bunch of terrible things. In fact, I believe we have linked loneliness to almost every negative outcome you can possibly imagine. Loneliness is bad. And this is because we, as a species, and there's very few things that I can say about mental health that are global, like universal level, but one of them is that we are a social animal. And sure, the types of relationships that we choose to build with others differs by culture and by person, but we are a social animal and we need to be around other people. And so that loneliness construct not only is linked to depression, but it's linked to a whole bunch of awful, awful stuff. All right. As we mentioned, depression's linked to suicide ideation. And I want you to understand that, but I also don't want you to make the mistake that a lot of people do in our news media and pop culture. Depression is not the only diagnosis that's linked to suicide ideation, all right? It's not even the one that's the strongest. Work absences, unemployment, greater usage of health care, or increased disability for adults who are over 55, being suspended from school. I really want you to pay attention to this greater healthcare utilization because it's very important for us to remember that mental health and physical health are in fact related. We like to bifurcate the head or the psychology from the rest of the body, but no, physical and mental health are profoundly interrelated. And that's important for those of you who might be nursing students or exercise science majors, but it's truly important for everyone who's alive, right? You need to understand that when you have things going on psychologically, there are going to be health symptoms. And when you have health symptoms, there are going to be psychological symptoms as well. All right. Now, when we talk about suicidality, what I will say is that hopelessness is what worries me more as a clinician than the depression itself. Because when someone is hopeless, they don't believe that things will get better. And that actually correlates better with suicide ideation than the depression itself. Okay. So, as if we just look at constructs rather than looking at disorders, hopelessness is a stronger construct. And let me tell you, if you pair hopelessness with loneliness, that is a recipe for disaster. That scares the core of who I am as a mental health professional. All right. Now, serotonin, for those of you who want to get back a little bit more into the biology, currently we think that too little serotonin circulating, and again, circulating in the synapse is what might be linked to depression. And that's why we have these drugs that are called SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And that's the way they work. They selectively block the reuptake of your serotonin so that you would have more serotonin circulating in your synaptic gap. That circulation is what we think is really important. It's also important to pay attention to cortisol, though. Cortisol is our stress hormone. And when you are stressed, physically or psychologically, your body releases more of this cortisol. And what we find is that if you have more cortisol in your blood, you also have more depressive symptoms. Okay, so stress and depression are most certainly related. Okay, again, a really important point for those of you humans who are listening to this. We need to pay attention to just how impactful stress is. We're going to have a whole module on stress as well. All right. Now, getting back to that loneliness, one of the things that is particularly important for me is for us to talk about belonging. Now, belonging is that construct where I feel like I belong to a group, that I have people who are a part of my social support network. That concept is called belonging. Okay. What we know is that when children are rejected by their peers, they then do not feel like they belong. They don't feel that social support, right? And that targeted peer rejection is actually strongly linked with depression, okay? What we find is that bullying victims report high levels of anxiety and depression when you compare them to people who have not been bullied. And that bullies themselves actually also report significant anxiety and depression. And if we look at traditional bullying, not cyberbullying, okay, if we look at traditional bullying, usually the person who has the worst symptoms is actually the bully and not the bully victim, which is fascinating. However, new research on cyberbullying, which of course is sadly a bulk of bullying right now, right? What we find is that this flips in cyberbullying. In cyberbullying, the depression is much stronger in your victims than in your bullies, but also depression is higher in both than any other form of bullying. Okay, so and a lot of that has to do with what cyberbullying is. I hope none of you out there have ever experienced it, but because I'm a realist, I know some of you have. For those of you who don't understand cyberbullying, the thing that's really problematic about cyberbullying is that it is non-ceasing. It's 24 hours. It can happen at any time of the day, whereas most bullying actually occurs during school hours. So your traditional, what we call traditional bullying now, that would happen between school hours. So, 8 to 4, 7 to 3:30, whatever is the school hours, and then you would leave and you would go home, right? That's not true with cyberbullying. Cyberbullying, it's 24 hours, weekdays, all night, whatever. And this is actually a decided flip when we think about the history of the internet. In the early incarnations of the internet, that was actually not the case. Many people who were bullied at school would actually find a great deal of solace online. But as more and more people came online, a lot of that safety changed. Now, if any of you are ever interested in talking about the history of the internet, you most certainly are always welcome in office hours, because that is, again, one of my specialty areas. Now, again, one of the things that I want to make sure you pay attention to is that bullying doesn't stop when you turn 18. First of all, there's something called adult or workplace bullying, and that's where adults bully each other in the workplace. We don't talk about that as much as we talk about the bullying that happens to children. It's also really important for you to pay attention to that. The bullying that happens to children, those children become adults. And sometimes there are the scars left of that bullying, especially if we're not talking about the bullying that is just that one human who just didn't like you, but like the non-ceasing cyberbullying or bullying that is at a group level or even what we would call institutional level bullying, which is where teachers actually engage in the bullying as well. All right. Um, so again, you can read some of these things that are some of our outcomes, but I do want you to pay attention to this piece about belonging and how important belonging is to mental health and how much we've associated peer rejection and loneliness and a lack of a sense of belonging to mental illness, all right, or to bad psychological outcomes. Now, when we think about depression, we also have to talk briefly about happiness, right? A lot of people think that happiness is the polar opposite of depression. Depression and happiness are somehow on the same thing. Um, but what I would encourage you to do is instead of thinking of these as a single continuum, that you think of them as two distinct axes, right? So there's depression axis and a happiness axis. And most of our research will support the idea that happiness and depression's symptoms are negatively correlated. The more happy, the less symptoms, right? Or the more symptoms, the less happy. But the absence of a mental illness is not the same as the presence of mental health. So just because I have no depressive symptoms does not guarantee that I feel happy or contented. Okay. So if we had a class on positive psychology, we could talk way more about happiness and contentedness and some of those kind of positive psychology pieces. Again, if you want to talk more about that, we can always do that in office hours, right? But the real key here for all of you is to just remember that just because you have the absence of mental illness does not mean that you have mental health, okay? And that's why happiness and depression are actually separate. So let's talk briefly about our mood disorders, okay? Again, bipolar disorder is our next category, right? Our bipolar disorders, again, there are three: bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and cyclothymia, and they're called bipolar because depression is sometimes referred to as unipolar depression, and bipolar has both depression and mania, two poles, bipolar. Now, if we want to break this down, bipolar 1 is more severe, and I often tell students to remember this as bipolar 1 is the number one severe, right? It's the number one most severe. And how do we know it's the most severe? And that's because they have both major depression and full manic episodes. We'll talk more about what a manic episode is in just a second. Bipolar 2 is second place. It's not as severe, right? And that's because you have your major depressive episodes, but you have hypomanic episodes, which are less severe than manic episodes, all right? And then you have your cyclothymic disorder. Now, again, cyclothymia, hopefully you've recognized that that thymia root means a chronic low-grade something, right? Cyclothymia is a chronic low-grade cycling mood, okay? So excellent way to remember that. Thymia cycles, right? Low-grade cycling, as opposed to dysthymia, which is low-grade depression, okay? It combines subclinical depression and hypomanic episodes. So you never have both. So again, it's less severe, but it's 2 years, okay? It's like dysthymia in that it's chronic and it's low grade, okay? So what is a manic episode? Well, a manic episode means that you have this elevated mood, which could also be irritable, for at least a week, and that you have to have 3, right, of these 7. All right. So inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, this means that I think I am amazing, right? And it's inflated, so it's not realistic. You're not actually amazing, right? But it's an inflated self-esteem. Number 2 there is a decreased need for sleep. Now, this is different than insomnia. Insomnia, you want to sleep and you can't. Decreased need for sleep means that you are so up, you are so elevated that you actually do not need to sleep to maintain the same amount of energy. Okay, very important difference there. Let's see, number 3, more talkative than usual, or pressure to keep talking. That pressure to keep talking is, like you have to fill all of the empty air. You have to just keep talking about anything. I mean, I don't know. There's like an orange book next to me, and I just have to talk about it because we can't stop talking. I just have to keep talking about all kinds of things. That would be a pressure to keep talking. Okay. Flight of ideas, or that your thoughts are racing, is number 4. Flight of ideas is where, again, racing thoughts, I think you can you can kind of understand. But flight of ideas is where your ideas come so quickly, right? It's hard for them to make sense with each other, right? So they seem very tangentially related. Number 5 is distractibility. Number 6 is increased goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation. Again, that's fidgetingness, right? Increased goal-directed activity. Now, sadly, a lot of times this number 6 is actually combined with number 7, which is one of my favorite phrases in the DSM, which is excessive involvement in pleasurable activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. All right. So, yes, you tend to be more goal oriented, but sometimes the goals that you're focused on have a high potential for painful consequences. That number 7 is things like compulsive shopping, risky anonymous sex, speed racing, I'm trying to think, a drug use, high alcohol use, right? So things that are pleasurable but tend to have very painful consequences, gambling, that sort of stuff. So again, 3 of those 7 for a week. And then the way we know it's a manic episode is actually in the D criteria, right? Sufficiently severe enough to cause marketed impairment in your functioning or to necessitate hospitalization to prevent harm to self or others, or psychotic features. Psychotic features are things like hallucinations. All right, so that's how we know it's a manic episode as opposed to hypomanic. Hypomanic, right, would be, let me go back a slide. Hypomanic, usually your D criteria is going to be more about it's going to cause marketed impairment that you do not need to be hospitalized, and there are never psychotic features. Okay, so the 7 tend to be the same for manic or hypomanic, but it's that D criteria that really changes. And that's again how you know that bipolar 1 is the number 1 severe. Okay. Now, just make sure you understand some of these terms. If you haven't understood them from this video, of course, you can always Google them as well, but just make sure you understand some of these terms because you will see them again, not only on a testing point, but also because they show up again in other diagnostic chapters. All right. So again, hypomanic episode, as I mentioned, it tends to be shorter. So we have this 4 days rather than a week. 3 of the same 7, right? But the change is clear and observable to others. And notice how short D is, not severe enough to cause marketed impairment, no hospitalization, no psychotic features. Okay. So this is all about, again, how well the client can function. And that's why functionality is so important for y'all to understand, is one of the key pieces of how we understand mental health versus mental illness in our country. Okay. So the last slide is a visual representation, right, of your mood, right? This dark line is cyclothymia. Remember, that's low grade. Notice how it's, bumps up into hypermanic, right? But it never gets down fully into depression, and it never gets all the way up into manic, all right? If there's a hypomanic episode, we can kind of think that there could be a subclinical level here, and you would see that the downturns actually would hit that subclinical level. All right. Our dashed line would be bipolar 1. Notice how it goes way up into manic, all the way down into major depression. We spend some time here in euthymic, major depression again, all the way up to mania. And then major depression here is the dotted line, right? You can see how it stays in euthymic. It never touches the 2 mania lines, right? And goes all the way down to depressive. If I was to put one here for bipolar 2, right, it would kind of follow this cyclothymic line in that it would go up, but it would kind of crash up into hypomanic, right, and go all the way down into into major depression, okay, hypomanic and depression. That would be bipolar 2. And if there was a euthymic line on this, right, it would just stay in this kind of non-shaded area, right? It would never touch the mania and it would never touch the depressive, okay? So hopefully that's been helpful. Make sure that if anything's unclear that you post to the FAQ board, and I'll see you online.